Listen to their music and their names.
Let's start our lecture. Hello, everyone. I will introduce myself one more time. My name is Emma Shi, the director of the International Piano Association, the Canada division. I'm very happy, and it's my honor to host my beloved teacher, Professor Bruce Vogt lecture. So let me introduce Professor Bruce Vogt. He appears regularly in concert across Canada and also inspire audience abroad. He toured Japan for the 15 times in October of 2019 and has toured China 3 times, teaching, lecturing, and playing concerts in a number of cities. He has given solo recitals and chamber music concerts in Europe centers including London, Oxford, Norwich, Paris, among other cities. Professor Vogt's repertoire is diverse, in compassion music from the 16th century to the present. He's long championed the music of contemporary composers, and he commissioned and premiered a number of new works by Canadian luminary as Marie Adeskin and Alfred Fischer. He's also a dedicated performer on period instruments. One of his recordings featured the music of Robert Schumann performed on a restored 1864 Erat. Other recordings include 2 volumes of the music of Franz Liszt, which established for him in unenviable reputation as a Liszt interpreter. In 2011, the bicentenary of the composer's birth, he recorded 2 subsequent Liszt CDs. In addition to his career as a soloist and chamber musician, Mr. Vogt is a professor at the University of Victoria because he sees working with teachers and young pianists as an important commitment. He lectures widely, leads masterclass and workshops, and an adjudicator for festivals. Let's welcome Professor Bruce Vogt, and he will give us a lecture titled Restricting War the River.
Good morning. Can I be heard? Yes. Thank you for that introduction, Emma. It was a privilege to be your teacher and now to be your colleague. First of all, I want to say that some of what Emma said is even true about me. My title, Playing the Piano, the Racetrack, and the River, I suppose is somewhat head-scratching, but I trust it won't remain that way. I do plan to talk about technique, but technique, as we all know, is not just about tips or about saying that's right and that's wrong. Importantly, it's about nurturing, about illuminating choices for the students to make as well. I am just about to leave the University of Victoria after 44 years of teaching. That number itself is exhausting. More broadly, though, I plan to continue performing. I am also saying goodbye to a life of teaching. I don't imagine that aside from the occasional coaching, I will return to it. This, of course, has me thinking a great deal about the subject of teaching, what it means to nurture a talent, to help them find the technique they need for their own voice in music. And more personally, it has me pondering just what it is I've been doing all these years. For someone starting out and finally deciding to be a professional instrumental or vocal performer, there requires a big leap of faith. I recall years and years ago hearing an interview on CBC with Charles Rosen, the famous writer and pianist from the US, who had come to UBC to perform and teach. I'm guessing this is perhaps 1985 or so. The interviewer asked a typical question, something like, what would you advise a young pianist who is considering performance as a career? Rosen's answer was simplicity itself. After a pause, he said, you simply refuse to be anything else. Well, it's a good answer, and yet it's not easy to refuse to be anything else. Most anything else could seem more practical, less torturous. We as teachers find ourselves having to help students come to grips with this more and more. As a teenager entering university, I felt as if I was competing with a whole world of pianists. And in competing with the world's finest performers, or even the finest young students, I felt considerably inadequate. For instance, while learning the Tchaikovsky concerto, the famous one, I couldn't help but compare my tempos to Richter's, how fast he played the middle section of the middle movement, or how fast his octaves were, etc. It felt hopeless, and in that sense it was. And anyway, I hated the process of competing, of reaching towards such a specific goal in this empty fashion. It would seem I was imagining technique as an object, something to be acquired in a way that, for instance, carpenters need to acquire a set of tools to do their work. Well, that sounds reasonable, but of course, technique is not really like that. It's not a thing each of us pianists gain in the same way. Musical technique is not an object. It's subjective. It's about each of us finding the means to fulfill what we hear, what we imagine, given our very individual physical equipment, which of course varies enormously, and our individual temperaments. As teachers, it's about helping the student sustain their commitment while carrying out this very subjective search. Even among the preeminent pianists of each generation, technique is very specific. Richter's is very different from those of Argerich, Gould from Schnabel, and so on. When students come from a studio sounding much the same, all sounding much the same, I find myself a little concerned about their studies when I begin to suspect they were learning to play towards the same goal, put through the same grinder, the same process, whatever their individual qualities were. But of course, competition, when kept in perspective, is valuable and even necessary. There's a famous quote of Samuel Johnson: "Depend upon it, sir, when a man knows he is to be hanged in a fortnight, it concentrates his mind wonderfully." Well, I'm not so sure the prospect of hanging would gift me with a centered mind, but a competition certainly centers work at the piano, making it more purposeful and more pragmatic. A second advantage of competition, second quality, to stretch my racetrack analogy even further, the young person remains isolated in their stable stall, especially when you consider that our instrument is one that makes a certain isolation inevitable. Without coming out and competing, they can easily get lost. We practice alone, and much of the time, and certainly more than most other instruments, we perform alone. We need to come out of the stable. But competition also allows students to learn from other competitors, from their fellow students. It provides them with a crucial perspective others can give to them, each in their way. Even a bad performance from another student, or also a professional, can teach a great deal. And in a class with a healthy atmosphere, there is a give and take among students. The class becomes a community. They feed each other's growth. Of course, the community is broadened further by the availability of performances by so many great pianists on YouTube and elsewhere. YouTube is potentially a great gift, a terrific resource. And if listening to great pianists is done openly and fully, students can not only take many important lessons about interpretation and technical solutions, but also they can learn a valuable lesson that there is no one way to interpret any composition. This is surely very and necessarily liberating. Finally, all of us have to face pressure, whether applying for a job, dealing with conflict, or, of course, performing. Competing is an essential kind of tool in learning how to mitigate anxiety, very much an important part of their journey in how to spread their wings, feel more of themselves, more authentically themselves. However, there are dangers to competition. When it has become the focus of learning, when young would-be performers imagine themselves on a ladder trying to get to the top, climbing furiously to get above other competitors, then it becomes unhealthy and truly unhelpful, even destructive. They are then trapped, isolated, alone on the racetrack. To say all this in a summary fashion about competition, competition is a two-pronged fork. On one prong, there is perpetual judgment, including self-judgment. On the other prong, there is emulation, that is, using the experience of competition as a way of learning from others and from oneself. In taking part in a competition in this way, you can try to learn as much as possible, one prong, or the other prong, you can find yourself hoping the other competitors will crash, which is not an elevated feeling. I was fortunate in my studies. I had a teacher who stressed playing the instrument as something to be conceived within the widest possible cultural and historic context. There was certainly still stress on technical solutions. They are, of course, of the utmost importance. But I could both then acknowledge the racetrack, learn to mitigate its dangers, and occasionally have a holiday from it. Admittedly, this took me a while. My goal could then become a search for a vision of the work that was inclusive of technical demands rather than solely about technical demands. Or, to put it another way, any work on basic technique now had a purpose beyond speed and power alone, as important as speed and power are. It was about finding out what was needed to evoke images, poetry, whatever. Technical study was clearly not just to be carried out for its own sake, but it was part of the joyful task of embracing, as much as one can, the psychological world of the composer and of his or her time. There is another crucial advantage to this approach. Most of even the finest pianists are not only pianists. They read, they often love art of all kinds. Some become fine writers. Stephen Hough and Glenn Gould come to mind. They have other interests. And potentially, they could have chosen another vocation. There is a whole world out there, and the piano is within it. Recognizing this, honoring it, may lead some young pianists to find their vocation lies elsewhere. And that is surely a good thing. It can be very self-diminishing for anyone to imagine that their level of excellence at the piano is all there is to justify who they are. And if they do ultimately choose a different direction, they usually find that studying piano has been a discipline that transfers well. That is, the ability to concentrate, to focus for periods of time. Those are crucial to studies in medicine and physics and literature and so on. Many of our finest surgeons are also good pianists. And parenthetically, they are also the only pianists who can afford a Fazioli. Speaking of Italian, the great Italian pianist and composer Ferruccio Busoni had a fine aphorism about the mastery of the piano. To it, Bach is the foundation of piano playing, Liszt the summit. The two together make Beethoven possible. Nowadays, we might include Ravel, Prokofiev, Rachmaninoff, and on, but Liszt anticipated most all of their technical textural innovations. Towards the end of my undergraduate year, I began to discover Liszt music in a more serious way. Now, Liszt is a composer whose legacy has suffered from more wrong-headed and slanderous attacks of a surprisingly personal kind than any other major composer I can think of. In many ways, his virtues were used against him. Virtues like his fascination with the expressive powers of the instrument and his desire to transcend the limits handed down to his generation. And most of all, his interest in the other arts, in culture, in politics, in everything, it seemed. These non-musical interests were seen as affectations, a way of justifying empty virtuosity by cloaking it in some extra musical meaning. And his generosity to other artists, has there ever been a pianist or an artist, in fact, more generous and more giving to other artists, other composers, the other performers. But his absorption of the music of composers, very different from one another. Chopin, Wagner, Italian and French opera composers, this seeming eclecticism was used against him, and unfairly so. Bela Bartok, the 20th century composer who understood him most fully, had this to say: whatever Liszt touched, he so stamped and so transformed with his own individuality that it became like something of his own. We can say he was eclectic in the best sense of the word, one who took from all foreign sources but gave still more from himself. The most vocal spokesman on his behalf was surely Alfred Brendel. He wrote a number of articles in the 70s and 80s, which had been collected in a book, Musical Thoughts and Afterthoughts, and another title I can't recall at the moment. But he talks about how he was compromising himself by speaking up for Liszt, that in some of the major centers, it was looked at askance that he, this great interpreter of Beethoven and Schubert and others, would waste his time. And another example, the great Chilean pianist Claudio Arrau, who had studied with Martin Krauss, a student of Liszt, he saw Liszt as one of the giants of the 19th century. As I recall, he placed Beethoven and Schubert alone at the top, and then very near to those two, he put Chopin, Schumann, and Liszt together in his pantheon. And yet he was told by impresarios that he should not play Liszt, that it would harm his reputation. Another example of how, by the way, he did eventually play Liszt, but it was not until the 70s. Another example of how Liszt has been misunderstood and denigrated. A few years ago, I heard an interview with a well-known pianist. You won't get the name from me, but one with a big career. The pianist told about playing Liszt's Prelude Electric Dante, but only played it because it had a reputation as a competition winner. So this pianist played it in a competition and won. So I guess she was right. He was right. This was said with a kind of a smirk, clearly saying, I only played it for that reason, for its impressive octave passages. And yes, the work does have lots of octaves. No doubt they were played fast and furious for the competition. More on octaves later. But Liszt's interest in other arts, well, in that way, he was only anticipating the next generations. Debussy insisted that his language owed more to the simplest poets than past composers. Perhaps he was exaggerating, but in his time and into our own, the unity of the arts was, and still is, taken for granted. So I came to realize during my first years after university and during studies in Europe and elsewhere, that Liszt's music was teaching me a great deal about how to play the piano. His music became a vital part of my repertoire and remains so, if at times only peripherally. So I want to look at some works a little bit and see what they say about technique and what do they say about the river. Consider Liszt's Année de Pèlerinage, Years of Pilgrimage. There are 3 volumes, as you all know, I'm sure. The compositions in the first 2 volumes are all connected to extra musical works of art or philosophy or history or nature. And the first book, Switzerland, gives us work inspired by Byron in particular, who had an enormous influence on continental Europe mid-century. And the nature pieces, of which there are many, are often connected to poems. The biggest work is Vallée d'Obermann, which is inspired by a novel of Etienne Pivert de Sanancourt of the same name. This work is prefaced by 2 quotes from Sanancourt's novel. Here is the first of them. What do I wish? What am I? What shall I ask of nature? I feel I exist only to waste myself in incomparable longings, inexpressible sensibility, the charm and the torment of our futile years, vast consciousness of a nature that is everywhere incomprehensible and overwhelming, universal passion, indifference, the higher wisdom abandonment to pleasure, I have felt and experienced them all. Now, Seneca was a big influence in the first half of the 19th century. Georges Sand was somebody who actually brought his reputation further. In this quote, you can hear the self-loathing, seeking for meaning, which he often finds futile. There's another poem in the introduction by Byron, which I won't read, but it's expressing some of the same sense of self-disgust. Now, Liszt's work is a remarkable lament. It has a bitterness reminiscent of the bitterness. Well, I thought of Shakespeare's Hamlet, and just 3 lines from it. O God, how weary, stale, flat, and unprofitable seem to me all the uses of this world. That's, by the way, he said that before he found out his father was murdered. The first section of Liszt's work begins with a mood of extreme self-loathing beyond despair in the key of E minor. And Emma, if you could bring up that first one. Great. Can I be heard again?
Yes,
here we go. Okay. That whole section is repeated in an intensified fashion. And then we go to something entirely different, a section in C major, which seems to suggest a hope for meaning, for a kind of paradise on earth, possibility of light, the end of despair. So. Well, these two very opposite, very, very contradictory sections now have to kind of battle it out. And we have this next section. If you do not look at the meaning of this piece, it just says quasi cadenza, lots of octaves. But if you recognize it for what it is, in some ways, it is reminiscent of the slow movement of Beethoven's Fourth Concerto. The battle between something negative and soul destroying and something pleading for something better. Let's just hear a bit of that section. Okay. Can I be heard? Yes. Okay. Um, if the performer has no idea beyond the notes on the page, this section can sound awfully empty, but it's not at all when it's understood. Let's hear a bit of the ending. At the ending, he brings back the C major section in the home key, or in a home key of E major now, and let's just hear towards the end of it, where it gets faster and faster, more furiously striving, and then collapses in despair. Oh. Now you notice how he's incorporated that falling figure that comes from the beginning into that. And let's go a little bit further. Okay, this is good. This is towards the end, and you will hear at the very end, it collapses in despair. Now, some of you might know this work very well. And if you do, I apologize for reiterating what perhaps you already know. I want to look now a couple of works, 3 works altogether in the second book, if we have time. How are we doing for time? I think we're okay. The second book is subtitled Italy, and the very first piece in it is based on a painting by Raphael, Sposalizio, The Marriage of the Virgin. And Liszt thought this connection was so important that he insisted his publisher include a copy of the painting in the score. If you can bring up the painting, yes. Now, there's a number of things to notice here. This looks like, it doesn't look like a synagogue, but of course, somehow they seem to have gotten married in the Renaissance time in a Christian church. But that's not my point. It's just something to notice. You notice, first of all, that the light and the way that the painting draws us upwards with the stones behind them, the steps up behind them, that becomes very important in Liszt's setting. Now, the first thing we hear in Liszt's setting is the sound of the bells. And I remember when reading about this at some time that somebody before the First World War studied how the bells in North Italy were, that Liszt's use of a certain motive were reminiscent of those bells. This can no longer be shown because those bells were melted down for cannon balls in the First World War. There's some symbolism, pretty powerful symbolism there, but we'll leave that aside. So let's hear the opening of this, where you really hear the sound and the light of the painting. Now, to me, that's one of the most remarkable openings of any piece of music. The integration of the bell sounds and the light of those remarkable harmonic changes in triple piano. Now, after a short interlude, very short, there is what is clearly a processional, and it is clearly Ave Maria. If there is any doubt about that, you can even say the words in the beginning of it. If there's any doubt, Liszt late in life, when he was writing music for religious music for the church, actually used this passage as the basis for a choral version of Ave Maria. So I won't stop and start. There's 3 things to notice in this. First of all, you hear the Ave Maria, very slow. It's 6/4, but back and forth. And then you will hear the sound of the leitmotif becoming insinuated into the music. And then you will hear the music rise and rise and rise and rise. And it's truly like following the painting up to the top. So, oh, and before you start, Emma, right after that, then we have the Ave Maria accompanied by the light motive in the left hand. And then there's a kind of for the glory of God as it opens outwards. Well, so we'll hear some of that section. Now, Emma, I have about 15 minutes. Should I be cutting that? I see the time. Are we okay? Can't hear you.
Oh, we are okay.
Okay. I'll try not to be too long-winded. The next work we'll look at just very briefly is based up, it's called Il Penseroso, and it's based upon two things by Michelangelo. One is a statue of the thinker. It's often called the thinker, and the other is a poem he wrote. Maybe you could bring up, well, when I can't talk when you brought it up, can I? Or can I? There's the Lorenzo de Medici. The poem is a statue addressing us. I am thankful to sleep and more thankful to be made of stone. So long as injustice and shame were made on earth, I count it a blessing not to see or feel. So do not wake me, speak softly. So this work is somber, austere, and not long, yet it feels not at all like a miniature. It suggests a kind of stone fragment from a large, imposing sculpture. So the ending surely anticipates a Wagner. Let's go to that second one, Emma, if you can. I think I said the beginning. Yeah, come on. Yeah. Now you can certainly hear the kind of despair at the human condition. There is a kind of made of stone quality to that work to me. Okay, quickly to the last work I want to talk about, which is perhaps the most famous. It is the Prelude to Dante, which I referred to as the unnamed pianist casting aspersions on it. This work, the title, by the way, doesn't mean after a lecture by Dante. It means after a reading of Dante. And there is a poem of Hugo with the same name, Victor Hugo, and undoubtedly Liszt took his title from this poem, which begins with the words, "When the poet paints hell, he paints his own life." This makes it clear that the poem and the composition, unlike Dante's Inferno, are dealing with struggles in this life. When I was first studying this work, about 35 years or 40 years ago, it led me to realize that I needed to read Dante. I actually audited a graduate course on Dante's Divine Comedy. This took up many hours over a number of weeks. Imagine that I could have used all those hours practicing. Anyway, the opening of it is kind of a parody. The opening of the work is a kind of parody of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony opening with the open fifths. Here's the opening. This is the tritone. And this Liszt did not write in instructions where it comes from, but a student of his, Walter Bosch, had studied with him, and Liszt gave some suggestions of what parts of the Inferno this is from. So, as some of you know, in the Divine Comedy, Virgil leads Dante through hell and then purgatory and then paradise, showing him the proper way. So he gets to see people that are being tortured for eternity. So the famous sign over the hell, it's quite a number of lines, but it ends with very famous, "Abandon hope, all ye who enter here." And you can hear that in this opening. We'll just play the first. Okay, this is developed, and then it comes to a second section. The themes are all throughout are almost drawn from one or two musical gestures. This next section, which is marked with very long pedals, and on the modern grand, one has to mitigate this a little, maybe a little bit less than full pedal, but it should not be openly pedaled and just pounded away as octaves. Is just what you sometimes hear. This is when he's first going into the hell after seeing this gate, he hears these wild, horrible cries and sighs and lamentations, and he sees these figures kind of swirling in the air. Anybody who's seen the old Christmas Carol with Alistair Sim, when he looks out the window with Jacob Marley and sees all these figures with chains, that's clearly taken directly from this scene in Dante's Inferno. Anyway, the sound is so horrible that, well, Dante's constantly fainting when he gets horrified. So the sounds are so horrible he faints. And this is Liszt. And keep in mind that Liszt, hell is made in circles. And you can hear this in this theme. just want to look at one other section. We could look at 10 or 12, but there's one that's so extraordinarily beautiful, and it's based upon the most famous section in the Divine Comedy, or at least in the Inferno, which is the story of Paolo e Francesca. Now, Francesca was married unhappily. They did exist in real life. It was a political union, which means she was just forced to marry someone she didn't know, quite a bit older. But she became closer to her husband's younger brother. One day, Francesco tells Dante, the two were reading the tale of Guinevere and Lancelot, who are the Arthurian characters who succumb to their love for each other and become lovers, an affair in the story that leads to the fall of Camelot. Well, as Paolo and Francesca learned, quote, how love had mastered Lancelot, we went pale as we caught each other's glance. And then, coming to the part of the story where Guinevere finally gives in to Lancelot's love for her, Paolo, again, quote, trembled to place his lips upon my mouth. That day, we did not read another page. But of course, this led to another form of furious communication. And then they were discovered thus by her husband and murdered. And there's a famous line from this, there is no greater pain than in our misery we are reminded of happy times. Dante is overwhelmed with pity and cries so hard that once again he faints. But anyway, it's a powerful passage, and this is Liszt's depiction of it. The first. Sorry, just very briefly, what we're hearing now is the lamenting of the creature of the two, and then we hear this strange, beautiful, full. If I can be seen, I'll signal it. Okay. Could you hear me? Yeah. Yes. Okay. There is much more to be found in this musical expression of Dante's great work. Much more than octave passages to practice and difficult leaps to master, though, of course, all of the technical difficulties are to be conquered as best as one can. Ideally to the point of real mastery. But now they inspire us to search for their solution with the imaginative link to Dante's Inferno as a starting point and the end point. How much more interesting is that? A couple of years ago, I was reminded once again how powerfully the imagination can enhance piano playing when the mind is engaged beyond music, beyond the score. One of these works was played by a student of mine in her final undergraduate year. She is now in master's program elsewhere. She studied and became rather obsessed with Valet d'Obermann, Ultimately, she played all of the year one of Ane de Pèlerinage for the second half of her graduating recital, which is in total about an hour of music. But it was Valet Doberman that led her into this project. She became a passionate reader of Senancour's book. Her playing took major leaps forward along with her confidence, her belief in her own abilities. There was a terrific growth in color, in range, in expression in her playing, and yes, in technique. Before I end, I think I need to explain the river reference in my title. I have a couple of friends, and I know some others, who are obsessed with thoughts about their legacy. What will happen to their poems, their research, their novels and other books, their paintings, etc., after their death? The answer, of course, is that they will be forgotten. Even Shakespeare ultimately will be forgotten. Maybe it will take some centuries. It's impossible to know. But we and all our creations will be utterly forgotten. A friend of mine, a poet and scholar, suggested to me an image of the ongoing tradition of the arts that I find much, much more beautiful. How the world of art how the world of art and of ideas is a contribution from generation to generation. Her image is that of a river moving, flowing through time. It is a river which any of us who join in the world of arts or of the humanities more generally, as artists, as scholars, as teachers, as supporters, as enthusiasts, indeed join into anything of value, each of us may add something to this river. Our contribution may be a small rivulet or a raging stream or something in between. Nevertheless, this river is where go all our efforts, whether modest or monumental. Surely this is a much better metaphor for tradition than a racetrack. I think we can all agree it's better for our shared struggles towards a better world, this metaphor that expresses the ongoing process in humanistic forms, very much at odds with any individual who is anxiously pining to be remembered. I have found myself embracing this metaphor. It is soothing. It does not sneer at anyone's gifts, including our own, nor at anyone's efforts. It's fundamentally democratic. It's very loving, very generous. I cannot think of a better analogy for the flow of ideas and artworks from countless generations within which we are a part, every one of us. And this concludes.
Thank you so much, Bruce. Your body gesture just bring me the times when I study with you, and you show me how can I make the sound for those specific the parts. Yeah, like now when in my teaching, I using some body language as well. Oh, I know now. I remember where it comes from. Yeah, because we have like a very short time. I just gave you a quick question. Because not many of the teachers lucky like me can have the time and experience to study with you. But could you give them a short conclusion, like how can you provide the tone and imagination and bring those literature into the really giant romantic pieces? How can you make the connection between those different components?
Well, if they're advanced students, there are lots of resources. There's a very good book by Paul Roberts on Liszt and this connection to the other arts. Paul Roberts also wrote an excellent book on Debussy and his connection to the other arts. If they're younger students, well, first of all, I must say it's been quite a while since I taught younger students. I mean, less advanced. But it seems to me that stories that of this and poems and things, even of the simplest kinds, are so often to be found in or can be found in even the simplest music. So I just would encourage people to, and probably they don't need my encouragement for this, to find ways that really dramatize what students should dramatize for the student. Why should they bother with all those bloody scales and chords and arpeggios and octaves and double thirds, etc.? Really, what there's a reason beyond the racetrack. It's being able to play faster and louder.
And do you recommend using the basic technique to enhance their technique like arpeggio or scales, or you just want them to practice the passage from the music? Because
No,
all of us understand like the real music present all those technique is different than when we practice Hanon, right? Like the finger exercise, the tone and the approach is completely different. So what's your recommendation?
well, obviously there's still a use for Czerny, but that was a time when they said you could read a book while playing them over and over because there was an idea that the fingers needed to be equally strong, and therefore you just built up muscle. Well, there isn't a lot of muscle in the fingers; it's quickness, and Chopin in particular was one who said the fingers are all different. We should use them differently, but nonetheless, there's of course not only a place for, but a necessity for scales, chords, arpeggios. The important thing is that they aren't treated just like calisthenics. You just zoom through them and then go on. It's really interesting if you play, let's say, a scale in E major and 4 octaves up and down, hands together. If a student, as they very often do, has a problem with the thumb where they get an accent because their hand falls, and the same in the left hand. Well, those collapses happen at a different place in each hand, in each part of the scale. So you could actually play quite an impressive sounding E major scale or any scale with that very serious problem completely hidden. One needs to use the scales in a way that, and the exercises that enhance one's attention, not dull it. Repeating something over and over. Well, I think it's in the movies anyway, it's used for hypnosis. So it doesn't add to it. We want to be fully conscious, and that's the hard work, is to remain fully conscious in all our technical work. Our bodies are very intelligent if we let them be, if we experiment and allow that kind of conversation with our own bodies, our own technique to be constant. Then the technical exercises, even Hanon, have a place for certainly.
All right. Okay. Now I'd invite all the teachers to ask question. And if you have any question, just unmute your microphone and you can speak louder and we can hear. Anyone has question? Okay, it's quite silent. Okay. Yeah, I have a last question. Like, what kind of the finger exercise you recommend to practice for Liszt? Is it by the Liszt written by himself, the one like all the finger exercise, or you recommend other people's?
Oh heavens, I would draw from all sorts of sources. I mean, there's some very good and interesting exercises in the Liszt selection, but I would draw from it from lots of different ones. I use something called oh dear, suddenly can't think of the name. Chrysander exercise. It's available on IMSLP because it gives you a pattern, which a formula pattern taking all through all the keys. So you can take any exercise, any problem, and you can solve it not just for the place in the music where you're worried about, but solve it for future as well. And it's if you have a difficult passage in a work and you play it over and over again, you will end up hating it, or more likely it'll end up hating you. But if you can take that problem and kind of solve it in a kind of macrocosmic way for everything, for any possibility, then when you go back to the piece, you haven't beaten it into submission.
Oh, could you write down the name on the chat? So, and I will paste the LSP.
Where do I do that? Chat.
The chat, right?
Okay, here we go. Chris Center. That will bring it up. That would bring it up on IMSLP. I have a feeling.
Let me quickly find the technique study. Okay, I got it. So here's a link for anyone need it. So that is the resource.
Wow.
Okay, all right. Since yeah, everyone if you don't have questions, we will very grateful, very appreciate Professor Bruce Vogt to give us such like the literature and the music to bring us to the such like romantic like the area already. Thank you so much, Bruce.
If I could just add, if any, I'm hoping that there were no questions isn't an ominous sign. If anybody has any questions or wants to talk about anything, should I put my email down? Would that be the simplest?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, or they can send me the send email to me, and I will forward it to you. I will
Okay,
collect all the questions if they have.
here's my email address though, and or would you prefer it go to you?
Either way, yeah, either way works for me. Okay, all right. Thank you, everyone. And next week, next Tuesday, will be our last session of this year. The great presentation by Professor Ingrid Claryfield. She's one of the top piano pedagogy leaders in the US, very famous one. She will bring like 20 tips for the piano practicing and the teaching. So we look forward to hearing from her and all of you, the question from you. Okay, all right, let's stop here for today. And thank you so much for your attending, and thanks a lot for Bruce. Talk to you soon. Okay, bye for now, everyone. Have a good day.